You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you in further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter into deeper waters.
Hello everyone, I am Nick Peters, the host of the Deeper Waters podcast, ready to bring you another exciting entry into the world of apologetics today. And, one good thing about getting to do a show like this is I'm interviewing constantly leading scholars and professionals in the field, just drinking in their wisdom, getting as much as I can, and it's so thrilling. But today I decided I had to settle and bring in Mike Licona instead. So, hi Mike, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks Nick, appreciate it.
Yeah, and Mike knows about my sarcastic humor very well, and he should, because as many listeners know, as of about nearly 3 years now, he's one of the guests that I can bring in the studio and say, "Hi, Dad."
And hi, son.
Yep. Yeah, that was nearly 3 years ago. 3 years next month. Your daughter and I will be celebrating our third wedding anniversary.
That's correct, and I'll tell you, we are proud to have you as a son-in-law, Nick. We really are, man.
Yep, and you're definitely proud to be an empty nester now, from what I hear.
Yeah, you bet. It's, parenting's like playing baseball. In baseball, the strategy is get them on base, get them over, and get them in, and for a run, and parenting, get them into the world, get them growing up, get them out and on their own. And, so we've been empty nesters now for 2 weeks, and it's just wonderful.
Okay, well, Mike, we're here to talk about your book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach, but my listeners, if they don't know who you are, why should they be taking what you say seriously today?
Well, because I know Gary Habermas.
So do I.
Yeah, so that's why they should be listening to your show. I would say, my own thoughts are that when I am interested in a topic, that even if I don't agree with a particular person on that topic, I can still learn something from them if they have studied that topic more than I have. When it comes to the field of New Testament studies, there is a lot about the New Testament that I don't know. In fact, there's probably more about it that I don't know than about what I do know. But I have studied the topic of Jesus' resurrection quite a bit, and probably more than most people. And so even if a person doesn't agree with me on minor or major issues, there may be a few things that they might be able to learn as a result of a dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Now, where did you get your education at?
Well, I did my undergraduate at Liberty University, where I was a music major in saxophone performance, and then I was just growing in my desire to know the Bible better, especially the New Testament. So I took some Greek in undergrad and just fell in love with it. So I went for a Master of Arts degree in New Testament at Liberty and studied primarily with a guy named Ron Sauer, who was the last doctoral student of the late F.F. Bruce. And Ron Sauer just had a passion for mastering the Greek New Testament. He was so good at the Greek language. And so I wanted to get as much as I could from him. And so I took every Greek class that I could from Ron Sauer, and I learned a lot. So I got my MA in New Testament at Liberty, and then I went on and did a PhD in New Testament studies at the University of Pretoria, where I studied under a New Testament scholar, a Johannine scholar named Jan van der Watt, who is the general editor of the Review of Biblical Literature, which is part of the Society of Biblical Literature. Great, great guy. I don't know that I could have had a better doctoral supervisor, a fine Christian gentleman, and really enjoyed my time with studying with him.
And this book is, in fact, pretty much your dissertation, isn't it?
It is. It's a slightly revised and expanded version, slightly revised, slightly expanded version of my dissertation.
Now, what exactly are you doing?
The only expansion really was the appendix, in which I deal with Dale Allison's proposal.
And what are you doing nowadays, other than enjoying being an empty nester?
Well, for the last 5 years, come August, 5 years, I've been engaged in a more in-depth study of the Gospels because, as you well know, one of the major, if not the major objection given by skeptics against the historical reliability of the Gospels is that they have contradictions. They contradict one another. So I've been reading through the Gospels several times in Greek, and that really just slows me down because I can't read Greek as well as English. And I'll be 52 next month and a Christian since the age of 10. So, when you've been a Christian around 40 years and reading the Scriptures, sometimes, you've read the Gospel so much, your mind can go on autopilot. You end up skipping over things. So reading them in Greek causes me to slow down and look at them very, very carefully. And as I've done that, I have found just tons and tons of differences in the way the Gospels tell a story. And so I have arranged them in what I thought are categories of what I think the evangelists, which is the academic term for the authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what the evangelists were doing, why these differences. But of course, I acknowledge that's speculation. It has plausibility, but we don't know if that's actually what they did. So what I figured maybe a way to get a little more certainty to see what they were doing is to read carefully the other biographies of that same period, and there were somewhere between 80 and 100 of them, and to see what kind of biographical liberties these other biographers took, and see if this is what the evangelists were doing. And so the primary biographer in that day is Plutarch, and we have 50 biographies that he wrote that have survived. And so I'm combing through them. I've identified roughly 50 stories in Plutarch's. Of those 50, there are 9 biographies that involve people who lived at the same time and who knew one another, and it involves the fall of the Roman Republic. And so there are about roughly 50 stories in those 9 biographies that appear in more than one of them. And so I'm studying these very, very carefully. I'm through about 10 or 11 of them, and I'm being able to see how the same author told the same story differently, and how there are differences, the same kind of differences that skeptics would refer to as contradictions in the Gospels. These same kind of differences, contradictions appear in Plutarch. But if it's the same author telling the same story, well, he's not going to be contradicting himself most likely, at least on not such a consistent kind of contradiction. So these differences, I think, are better understood as biographical liberties Plutarch was taking. And I've been able to identify 7 of these liberties so far with the help of Christopher Pelling, who teaches at Oxford. He identified 6, but I'm able to identify a whole lot more examples because he only considered a few of these parallel stories. I'm considering a whole lot more. So I'm identifying the 6 that he talks about, many more examples of these, plus I found a new liberty, and I think there's even some more to be discovered. And Nick, what I'm finding is every single one of these 7 liberties that Plutarch takes, these biographical liberties, the evangelist took, and I'm able to provide numerous examples. I'm finding numerous examples of these liberties in the Gospels. So it's a very, very interesting study. And, I have some friends in Indonesia, and they were very gracious. They were very interested in this research, and they raised a research grant for me. So that will cover roughly, maybe a third of my income. And it allows me to come off of the road and not travel so much this fall and devote myself far more to research. So I'm very excited about it.
of course, when this fall comes, though, I think you're going to be teaching, aren't you?
Yes. I have been blessed and honored to be a faculty member of Houston Baptist University. And they've been having me teach some graduate level and undergraduate level courses. And this fall I'll be teaching 2 undergraduate level courses, New Testament Survey or Introduction at HBU. And both of these are online classes. So even someone who doesn't live in Houston or attend school there can sign up for one of those courses because it's entirely done online. And I did that for the first time, the online, this last semester at HBU, and it went so well. The students just really enjoyed it. We tried to make the class very interesting, a little different than your typical online class. But all of it can be done online, and again, I'm just so proud to be a faculty member at HBU. It is really a fine academic institution. Mm-hmm. I love their approach that every faculty member must be an evangelical Christian who subscribes to a minimum number of beliefs such as the virgin birth, the divine inspiration of the Bible, Jesus' atonement for his sins on the cross, his resurrection, the deity of Jesus, salvation by faith, the second coming of Christ, and that's pretty much it, if I remember. And so all of us are evangelical Christians, but we are an ecumenical faculty consisting of Protestants like myself. So, I've been from the Baptist Presbyterian tradition, and there are, like our provost, John Mark Reynolds, and he's an Orthodox. We have Episcopalians who teach there, we have Catholics who teach there, and we have Calvinists and Arminians, and we all get along really well, and it's just really neat. It's neat to see, a Catholic and a Protestant, professors, we all have these basic evangelical beliefs, and we get along well, but I just imagine a Calvinist and an Arminian, are you kidding me? And they get along at HBU. It's pretty cool.
It's kind of ironic when you talk about Christians getting along, because when this book of yours first came out, some Christians didn't really get along with you, did they?
Well, that's true. It took about, about 8 months, and then, one Christian started and raised the controversy, and God bless him. I think he was well-meaning, but I think he's just mistaken.
Yeah, and I think very well during that time it was myself, my ministry partner, and a few others like Max Andrews and others who were doing most of the writing on your behalf at that point in time, wasn't it?
Yes, and I really appreciated that, Nick, from you, JP, and Max. You guys did a phenomenal job. And, for me, I thought it was an issue that just should not have been made an issue, that it was one that should have been debated, first of all, like in an academic forum, and that's why I was very impressed with Danny Aiken, the president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Heath Thomas, who got a virtual roundtable to discuss this in an academic forum. I mean, that's the way it should have been done. And I'm glad they did it that way, and we had a very productive discussion. As anybody can read the roundtable online, they can go to my website, and it's listed there, but it was published in their academic journal last summer, so about a year ago, and it went really well. But I thought you and JP and Max did a really good job. For the most part, I just kind of stayed out of it because I just thought it was a small matter that really didn't deserve the kind of attention it got. And I just wanted to go on with my ministry and my research and not get bogged down in this, and I was counseled to do that by some other evangelical scholars, and I'm glad I took that. It gave you and JP and Max some good exposure, well-deserved exposure, and it was good.
And to make sure some listeners out there might be clear who case there are some rumors and such, how many times did you tell me what to write in my blog?
Well, I never did.
Absolutely.
I didn't want to get involved with it. And
yep.
You guys, all you and Max and JP are all good thinkers, and you guys can think for yourselves. So.
And in case any listeners are out there wondering, even though Max, my father-in-law, we get along well, we do have those times we disagree, and when I've told him but I think he's wrong on something, I haven't hesitated to let him know. And when it comes to this interpretation they had, now I'm not entirely sold on it yet, but to say it denies inerrancy, that's where I had a problem. But, I mean, if I seriously thought Mike was in error here with having a belief that was dangerous, I think he knows I'd be the first one to let him know.
Yeah, I do believe that. You're not hesitant to do that. I wouldn't want you to be. I wouldn't want anyone to be, really. I think Christians are certainly going to disagree on things. Gosh, even the apostles disagreed on some stuff.
Yep.
James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul had their disagreements. Peter and Paul had their disagreements. But you have to disagree with one another in love and respect. And it's best to go through the proper forum in things, and do things in a manner that's going to help the kingdom, rather than giving it a black eye. So I didn't want to get involved in a circus on the internet, which my detractor wanted to, and I just refused. And I think that really ticked him off. But I didn't think the internet was the forum for me to get involved in this, and so I just allowed him to be a single voice.
I find it ironic that we were told repeatedly that you had to be enemies of Christ, a powerful weapon with your interpretation, but the only weapon I saw them bringing forward on the internet was, see, if these Christians can't agree, you have to believe such and such to be in an academic setting, therefore we have to be more suspicious. It seems like, if anything, your detractors were handing the enemies a powerful weapon.
Yeah, well, perhaps. But I try to be an honest scholar, and I try to be as objective as possible, and because I'm after truth. And I know that sounds kind of trite. A lot of people would say that, and surely everybody would claim it. And so I don't want to just be another voice just claiming that. But, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And, fine, show me I'm wrong, but I'm not going to say I'm wrong if you haven't shown me I'm wrong, or I don't think I'm wrong. I want to be honest in things out there, and there's no doubt some people took it and put it in such a way that it may have undermined confidence of some in the scriptures, but that could be because it was misrepresented. Or maybe some people just have an overly wooden view of what the Bible, overly wooden view in terms of interpreting the Bible in a literal basis. I'm all for literal interpretation, so I don't want to be misinterpreted that way, but there are certainly many things in the Bible we are not to interpret in a literal way. I think much in the book of Revelation can be put in that category. Certainly when Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. He didn't mean that in a literal sense. We can see where some of the, like Matthew redacts some things that the way Mark puts it. So like when Jesus says, unless you hate your father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, you cannot be my disciple. Really? We're supposed to hate? Matthew redacts that and for clarification and changes Jesus' words to say, unless you love me more than father, mother, brother, sister, wife, children, you can't be my disciple. It's the same saying. It's in the same context with what comes before and afterwards. So it's not a different occasion. One has redacted the other, and my guess is Mark preserves the more of what Jesus literally said, speaking in hyperbolic language, but Matthew changes some things so that people won't misinterpret Jesus. So there's a sense in which the literal words of Jesus have not been preserved with Matthew, but the meaning is probably preserved in a better way for Western minds than we find in Mark in that particular passage. So when we start seeing these things by comparing the Gospels with one another, there's a lot I've learned over the last 5 years as I've been doing that, and have now more than 60 pages of differences that I have found in the Gospels over that time. You start to see that the Gospels, the authors, the evangelists took biographical liberties. You start to understand why they did these things, and it just makes so much more sense. And so these differences, rather than undermine our confidence in the Scripture, once we really get a hold of them and understand what the evangelists were doing, can actually increase our confidence in the historical reliability of the Gospels.
We'll be back to wrap this section up very soon. I'm Nick Peters for Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is Mike Licona. We'll be back after this break.
Check out CYIWorldwide.com. CYIWorldwide.com. Home of Grok Radio. Free music downloads, advice, prayer, and support. CYIWorldwide.com. Do you grok?
This is Mike Licona. Nick Peters is my son-in-law, and I'm excited to announce his new podcast in which Nick will discuss and have guests on topics related to Christian apologetics and dealing with disabilities. Nick has already interviewed apologetic stars such as Greg Kokel and Rob Bowman, and I know of other stars he's in the process of inviting. So be sure to check out Nick's new podcast.
And we're back, and I must apologize for playing the endorsement of such a questionable character while you're on. I hope you don't mind that.
That heretic.
Oh, yes. But, it's kind of become a joke in our family, but I often refer to you as the arch heretic. It's so odd that this whole thing broke out over inerrancy, and all the while, you're doing all this study in order to resolve contradictions, supposed contradictions, in the Gospels.
Yeah, so, I'm not going to question a person's motives. I really don't know what they are. There's just always going to be disagreements. I just think, hopefully we learn through this that when a person has another theological a disagreement with another person and it's on a non-essential issue, that, you go through the proper protocol. I don't necessarily, if it's on a non-essential issue, and I'm talking about, something that's not a fundamental to faith, like, Jesus' atoning death, his resurrection, things like this. We're going to have theological differences. That is not a sin when you disagree with someone on a non-essential theological issue. So we're not talking about following a process like Matthew 18, where you go to that person, and then you have to take a brother if they don't listen to you, and then you bring them before the church. Because, again, we're going to disagree on some non-essential issues. Mm-hmm. So what do we do when we have these kinds of disagreements? I think you have to, at that point, you go and you do this in the proper protocol within, let's say, an academic forum. You read a paper, or you have like a roundtable discussion, or you write a journal article, where it gets in print and things can be considered. I think that's the proper protocol for something like that. And hopefully, evangelical scholars will learn and do things better the next time.
It looks like we've got someone who's just called in. Would you be open to taking a question?
Certainly.
Caller, you're on the air. And they hung up. Okay. Well, let's suppose, let's just wrap this part up with, let's suppose there's someone out there who's still skeptical of you based just on what they've heard from the other side. They think you're out there denying inerrancy and all these other things. What would you say to a skeptic listening like that?
Well, I'd say, first of all, biblical inerrancy is not one of the essentials of the faith. As one evangelical scholar said to me once, he said, the Bible doesn't say if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and that, according to the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, the Bible is inerrant. You'll be saved. You could get saved by having certain beliefs before any of the New Testament literature was written. So biblical inerrancy is not an essential doctrine of the Christian faith. And you'll have people like maybe an N.T. Wright, a Richard Bauckham, who would say that the scriptures are divinely inspired and authoritative without saying they're inerrant. And in fact, outside the U.S. and Canada and South Korea, biblical inerrancy isn't even an issue outside of those three countries, to my knowledge. They don't even talk about it in that sense. So, that said, I do embrace the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. I do think that the Bible is without error. Now, that said, I have to admit that given my 5 years of study in the Gospels and looking at all the differences, I think how we define an error is something that's going to be very, very important, and something that's going to have to be discussed. Because if you do take things in a wooden, literal sense, then there are certainly going to be errors in the Gospels, given the kinds of differences we see in them. Not all of these differences can be harmonized. So let's say, for example, Jairus' daughter, when Jesus raises her, in one of the Gospels, in Mark, it says when Jairus came to Jesus, he said, "Lord, my daughter is about to die. Can please come and heal her?" But when you read the same story in Matthew, Jairus says, "Lord, my daughter has just died. Please come and heal her." Now, which is it? Was she alive or was she about to die, or was she dead already when Jairus came? Well, if you take it in a literal wooden sense, you have an error in one of those Gospels because she can't be both almost dead and dead at the same time. But if you understand that Matthew has taken a biographical liberty called compression, which I can show Plutarch doing and other Gospels doing, then it's not really an error. So again, it's going to come down to what we're looking at as an error. But biographical liberties, taking them into consideration, I do embrace the inerrancy of the Bible.
Well, we don't want to spend our whole time talking about this issue. There are so many more important ones, such as the resurrection of Jesus, this book that you've written, which is pretty much a truity for us on it. I mean, at the Society of Biblical Literature was said that this is the new book on the resurrection, isn't it?
The SBL said that?
I thought that's what I was told. That was said SBL, that it had been said this one has now surpassed N.T. Wright's book. Maybe I misheard that, though.
Oh, I think you may be referring to when my book was introduced at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2010. Yeah. There's also the Institute for Biblical Research, which meets at that time. And that year, IBP paid for, there's probably 1,000 to 1,500 scholars and graduate students, doctoral students who attend this thing. And one of the three big publishers, IBP, Zondervan Baker, provides, they sponsor it, they provide refreshments, and they talk about some of their books. And Dan Reed, who was my editor, an acquisitions editor for my book, was the one who presented it. And Tom Wright had just given a talk, and I was sitting there next to the podium, and Dan Reed says, I never thought I'd say this, but move over to Tom Wright. We've got a new book on the resurrection, and it actually weighs in at about a quarter-inch thicker than yours. So,
Brian.
That was kind of cool.
Yeah, Brian Orton of the Projects 315, I remember him talking about him being in his house one day, and here comes a big forklift to his door delivering your book.
Yeah. He emailed me with that when it arrived at his place, so that was neat.
Now, it's interesting where you start this book at. It's not with a resurrection per se, but with historiography.
Yeah. After Gary Habermas and I wrote our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, as we were finishing that up, I should say, in the editing process, I can remember asking Gary, I said, there's probably not a greater expert authority in the world on Jesus' resurrection than you, especially in terms of knowing where scholars weigh in on various matters related to the resurrection. I know of no one who has studied that anywhere near as much as Gary. And so I said, why is it that we can all look at the same data and we arrive at different conclusions? And I said, how many people study in this topic? You know, what is their background? He said, well, almost all of them are New Testament scholars, and then you have a few philosophers. I said, well, any professional historians outside the community of biblical scholars? And he said, well, maybe just a handful that he knew of. And I thought to myself, well, do biblical scholars even get adequate training on how to do history? I mean, you know, my opinion on matters related to the Old Testament would be utterly worthless because it's not a field I've studied. So I started thinking, are New Testament scholars, how qualified are they really to study the matter of Jesus' resurrection from a historical perspective? How much training in the philosophy of history, historical method, how much training have they received? And then, you know, you look at it, I looked at the catalogs from the 8 Ivy League schools for 2 years, spring and fall for 2 years, in their departments of religion, theology, philosophy, and for undergraduate, graduate, doctoral level courses, and looked at every course in these departments and all these different levels, every course offered on the philosophy of history and historical method. And I totaled them all up, and the grand total was one course. One course out of all the 8 Ivy League schools, undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral levels for the departments of religious studies and philosophy. That's it.
Are you sure you did your math right?
Yeah. And a lot of graduates from, let's say, the religious departments, theology, biblical studies, are going to get out of these schools and claim to be historians, and they even haven't had even a single course on how to do history. So I thought, well, how would professional historians outside the religious community, those who have studied the philosophy of history and historical method, how would they actually go about studying something like the resurrection of Jesus to see if it occurred? So that's when I decided I was going to do my doctoral work on this. And Gary said he didn't know of anyone who had ever done an exhaustive work on this following historical method. So I said, well, I'm going to do this. And so I began studying the philosophy of history, historical method, by reading journal articles and books on how to do history. And so that's how I approached it, through historical method. And, that was my approach to the resurrection, purely historical. Lay faith aside, and let's see what we can come up with just looking at it as a historian would.
Now, if anybody's wanting to join in on the discussion today, the call-in number is 714-242-5180. If you have a question for Mike on the resurrection or anything we've talked about, feel free to call in. Now, what do you think, in light of this, when we go out and we talk to these skeptics on the internet and such, who make complaints about God revealing something in history, and that we can't rely on an event that happened 2,000 years ago to be reliable? You know what kind of talk I'm talking about, right?
Well, there's a couple objections there that you're saying. Number one, how can it be kind of like a Bart Ehrman objection? You know, if God did it, that's a theological explanation, not a historical one. And then the other objection involved in what you're saying would be something like the distance of time, 2,000 years. So in terms of the 2,000 years, I would say, the further we go into the past, things get a little more difficult. We can be more certain that George Washington crossed the Delaware than we can Caesar crossed the Rubicon. But we have plenty of good evidence, certainly adequate evidence, that strongly suggests that Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC. Or that he was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC. Can we be absolutely certain about the past? Well, in most cases, almost all cases, I'd say no. But you really can't be absolutely. There's very few things for which we can have absolute certainty. 100% certainty eludes us on most things. Unfortunately, when it comes to history, historians face the same challenges as archaeologists, geologists, and evolutionary biologists. We all cannot get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusions. So we use, in terms of history, we use strictly controlled historical method. Is it perfect? No, but neither is the scientific method. But with the scientific method, so with historical method, we find that it is generally reliable, and on a regular basis, it's far more reliable than other methods, such as tarot cards and magic 8 balls. So historical method's not perfect, but it's good. We don't get absolute certainty or guaranteed results, but we can have pretty good confidence in what historical method yields. So that's in terms of the distance. In terms of God doing things, there's a couple of different approaches to it. For one, I could say, we can look at the part of an event that, how can I say it, that is not theological in its elements. It's kind of like Jesus' death by crucifixion has a huge theological element to it, atonement. So could we conclude that Jesus' death on the cross atones for our sins? Can we conclude that historically? No. But we can conclude the historical element of that and say we can conclude that Jesus died as a result of crucifixion. But the theological element would have to be tabled, at least from the viewpoint of a historian. I think when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, I don't know that we as historians could show that to be true. We couldn't show that God was the one that raised Jesus, not historically. I think we could show or guess that he's probably the best candidate as the cause, but we could never really demonstrate that God raised Jesus. But I do think that we could show the non-theological element of that, and that is to say that Jesus was raised from the dead. I think we can show that, historically speaking.
Well, Mike, you must be a pretty popular guest here, because we've got 2 callers. It looks like we were wanting to say something. You ready to take a caller?
Sure.
Okay, well, I'll go with the first one who's called in here. And, caller, you are on the air with Mike Licona.
Mike?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, Mike. Hi, Nick. How you guys doing?
Hi.
Because I'm not too familiar with your work, and you were just kind of broaching the subject slightly, I wanted to know your opinion on William Lane Craig's model of defending the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus with his 4 facts: the buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the sudden emergence of the early church. I just wanted to know your take on that particular model and approach when speaking to skeptics or otherwise.
Yeah, good question. I like his approach. I mean, it's not the one I take, obviously, but it's I take a different approach, but I like Bill's approach. And the book that he wrote, where that's presented, the first one in the academic book, it's Assessing the New Testament Evidence for the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus by Mellon Press. An excellent book, very expensive, but I'll tell you, it's worth every penny of it. It's just one of the best books on the resurrection ever written. I like it. The empty tomb, I think, has very good historical evidence. It just didn't make the cut in my method because in order to be included as one of the relevant historical bedrock that I consider in my book, it has to be granted by virtually all scholars who study the subject, a heterogeneous group, in other words, from all theological backgrounds. You don't get that with the empty tomb. You get a majority, you get a heterogeneous background, but somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of scholars, so it didn't make the cut. Very strong evidence for it, but it doesn't have the kind of embracement of scholars that I would want for my method. In terms of the the growth of the Christian movement despite the death of its leader. I mean, I think that is an okay argument, but to be honest with you, I've never thought it was all that strong. So I don't like to use it. So I like what Bill does, and Bill knows his topic very well. I think it's a legitimate way of arguing for the resurrection. I just don't prefer it myself.
Okay.
And I could point out that this is, in fact, one area Mike and I disagree, because I do think the growth of the church is a pretty strong argument, but, that's a show for another day. But does that answer your question, Carter?
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Have a good
You're welcome.
We do have another caller, but we'll take him after the break, okay? Well, we'll be back after this break with our next caller to talk with Michael Licona.
Hi, this is Justin Briley of the Unbelievable Radio Show and Podcast, recommending another podcast to you. Nick Peters is a deep thinker, a friend of mine, and he has an inspiring faith, so you should listen to him and his excellent guests on the Deeper Waters Show. So keep going deeper and keep getting wetter, I guess. Blessings, Nick. Keep up the good work.
Are you tired of the same old corporate Christian music on the radio? Check out Music Surge on Grok Radio, playing Christian music that doesn't suck. Download episodes now at CYIWorldwide.com.
And I am Nick Peters. We are back with the Deeper Waters podcast. Our guest, Mike Licona, who seems to be pretty popular with lines lighting up. The caller number, if you want to join in, is 714-242-5180. And are you ready to take another caller, Mike?
Sure.
Okay. Caller, you are on the air with Mike Licona.
Hello, Nick.
Yes?
Nick, hi. I didn't know if I was on the air. This is Bob. I want to say hi to you and Mike.
Hi, Bob.
Well, my question is, what would you say to a skeptic that says, well, we can't know about the resurrection of Christ because all the New Testament documents were written by anonymous people? What would you say to those skeptics?
Well, then I'd say we really can't know, first of all, we really can't know much about the Greco-Roman world because a lot of what we know about the Greco-Roman world comes from Plutarch, and every last one of the 50 biographies he wrote that have survived are anonymous. And in fact, Plato's works, Porphyry's works, are anonymous. So it was a standard, though not across the board, for works to be anonymous. There were lots of anonymous works written by prominent authors. That doesn't mean that we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. The uniform testimony of the early church is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them. In fact, the majority of critics who have opined on the subject, written on the subject, say that Mark knew Peter and was writing the memoirs of Peter, and that the author of Luke's Gospel, although the majority don't necessarily identify him as Luke the physician, they will say that he was a traveling companion of Paul who got information from the eyewitnesses. When it comes to Matthew and John, there's a whole lot more debate. But even those who would deny the Johannine authorship of John, many of them would say that an eyewitness who knew Jesus, perhaps a minor disciple like Lazarus or someone, wrote the Gospel of John, or that the Gospel of John is largely based on the testimony from that disciple. In fact, Dale Allison, who is by no means an evangelical, and in fact he is, in his writings and in person, I've seen him describe himself as a cryptic deist, an agnostic. I heard him say at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature last year in Chicago, he said he has now come to the belief that the author of John's Gospel took the information and got almost all the information from one of Jesus' minor disciples. So even though he doesn't believe it was John, the son of Zebedee, he believes it was one of Jesus' disciples who provided almost all the information behind John's Gospel.
So I think when we look at the uniform testimony of the early church, that does have to count for something. And then when we look at other evidence that there is eyewitness testimony in these early Gospels, that counts as well. So the fact that they're anonymous, an argument that Bart Ehrman raises, I think is a non-issue. Because, again, every last one of Plutarch's lives that we have, and there's 50 of them, every last one of them are anonymous.
May I offer another suggestion on that line?
Sure.
First of all, these skeptics need to learn the definition of the word anonymous. And I think I think Nick knows what I mean by this. If you look at the definition, citing Merriam-Webster, it says, of unknown authorship or origin. Well, since the church knows the author of the Gospels, the authors of the Gospels, then it's no longer anonymous. It never was. Right? Doesn't that make sense?
I think that makes sense.
Oxford English Dictionary, it says nameless, having no name, of unknown name, or bearing no author's name, of unknown or unavowed authorship. But we do know the authorship, therefore it's not anonymous, right?
Yeah, I guess in a sense you could say, well, the church is claiming that, I mean, the books or the Gospels themselves may not be attributed to any particular person or claim authorship, but the early church claimed. So, in other words, when they're saying anonymous, someone like Ehrman saying the Gospels do not claim themselves to have been written by a particular author. And then if we were to say that, okay, but the church claimed it, he would just call into question the testimony of the church. But then again, he calls into question non-anonymous letters of Paul and Peter and Jude. So even if they have the person's name on it, he's not necessarily going to accept it.
Well, the thing about Ehrman is he's not an authority on the English language. The Oxford English Dictionary is an authority. So he's basically appealing to, it's a fallacious appeal to authority that he's wrongly assuming. If we go by the dictionary, it's not anonymous.
Well, they would be in the sense that the Gospels are not claiming authorship. So nowhere in Matthew does it say Matthew wrote it. The same can be said of Mark, Luke, and John. Their names do not appear. I should say there is nowhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John where the author makes claim of who it is who's penning that Gospel. And so
that's
in
true.
that sense, the Gospels are anonymous.
But the dictionary definitions don't account for that. Do you see what I mean? The document doesn't have to say who the author is, as long as the identity of the author is known, and that's according to the dictionary. If you take into account Common Sense by Thomas Paine, we know from the documents themselves, when they were first published, there was no name. And yet they can't be anonymous because we know who wrote it, even though the name is not on there. You know what I mean? So basically, Ehrman, if that's his argument, is arguing against the English language. The term anonymous,
I think Ehrman might
right
turn
there.
around and say one of the originals of Thomas Paine's writings would be anonymous. I think he would just turn around and say that, and in a strict sense, he'd be correct.
Okay,
it wouldn't be anonymous to the printer.
Okay, we need to be wrapping this part up here. So, guys, we got other callers waiting in line here.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. Nick, thank you very much, too.
Thank you.
Take care, and God bless you both.
Yep.
Right, bye-bye.
You too, brother.
For all interested, that is a good friend of mine. He's doing legal apologetics, and he does it very, very rare from what I've seen. But you ready for some more callers?
Sure.
Okay. Next caller, you are on the air with Mike Licona.
Hi, this is Joe in North Carolina.
Hey, Joe.
Hi, Mike. I just began reading N.T. Wright's Resurrection of the Son of God, and I would just like to hear your assessment of that, and maybe if you could tell us how your approach adds to it or differs from it, and I'll hang up and listen to your answer.
Okay. Thank you, caller.
I think it's an excellent book. I think the greatest contribution that Wright makes in that book is his treatment over several hundred pages of the beliefs in antiquity of the afterlife. I think he's very persuasive and correct in showing that when they spoke about resurrection, it almost always meant something that occurred to the corpse. It brought the corpse back to life. Now, when the Greeks didn't believe in resurrection, and the Romans, they wanted disembodiment. They wanted to be freed from the body. It's the Jews who believed in the resurrection, meaning something that happens to the corpse. It stood up again. It came back to life. It was revivified. So Wright does a really good job, I think, probably the best out there in showing that when the ancients spoke of a resurrection, they meant that it was something that happened to the corpse. The corpse came back to life. And I think his argument would be that that the burden of proof rests on anyone who wants to argue that when the early Christians say that Jesus was resurrected, that they did not mean that it was his corpse, that he only came back in spirit. The burden of proof would rest on anyone who made such a claim, since the earliest, what resurrection, the term meant, was something that happened to the corpse. Again, I think Wright has done just a fantastic job with that. Where my book differs from his, I would say that whereas I think such an argument is really good, paradigm shifts do occur. The Christians altered the Jewish view of God from one person to three. You had a triune God. The view of the Messiah, obviously most Jews in Second Temple Judaism believed that the Messiah was going to come and overthrow the Roman government. The Christians or Jesus didn't have such a view. His view of Messiahship was, yes, he was going to overthrow a greater authority, and that would be Satan, the powers of darkness. And then later on, at the end of the age, you would have the victory over the rest of the world. So it's kind of like the mopping up after the major victory over the evil one. So if you can alter a view of God to become a triune God, if you can alter a view of the coming kingdom, the role of the Messiah, certainly altering what resurrection means wouldn't be beyond what the Christians could do. That would be small in comparison to what they did with the concept of God. The question would be did they alter the view? Because we know the Gnostics later would alter the view of resurrection. So it's not that it couldn't happen. It did happen, but were the Christians responsible for that? And I think what I've done in my book is I've spent time on what the earliest Christians believed. And so I go with Paul on this. He's the earliest Christian writer that we know of. And we know that he had direct links to the Jerusalem apostles. And Paul speaks very clearly of a bodily resurrection throughout his writings. So that's how I would argue differently. I would just say, okay, the view of antiquity of resurrection is important, but it's not that important. I would prefer to argue that when the earliest Christians said resurrection, they meant something that occurred to the corpse, and that's what I argue. I would also say that although Wright spent quite a bit of time talking about the philosophy of history and historical method, and it's a very helpful discussion, I wanted more. And I wanted to go deeper with that. I wanted to be more detailed. I wanted to establish a more specific historical method to follow, and so that's what I did. I went through not only, I went through what is the philosophy of history, what is historical knowledge, how do we gain it, to what extent can we gain it, who has the burden of proof, questions like that, established a historical method, dealt with the question probably more thoroughly than anyone else that I know of on can historians investigate miracle claims. And then I did a detailed look at the sources and tried to assess them in terms of the confidence that we can have that they reflect apostolic testimony. And I looked at things such as the Gospels, Paul's letters, the Apostolic Fathers, some of the other non-canonical literature, and the Gnostic literatures and things like that. And I assessed them for their historical value in terms of apostolic testimony and going back to alleged eyewitnesses, and then working with those sources. What are the facts that we can know with virtual certainty from those sources? And then let's formulate our hypothesis, resurrection hypothesis, and then let's assess it, and let's assess 5 others of the leading alternative hypotheses out there to see how well they do when measured according to strictly controlled historical method. So those are some things I did that Wright did not do. So I think mine follows more of a strictly controlled historical method a lot more than Wright's does. But that's not to say Wright's work is inferior. It just takes a different approach. And I like N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of Man. I like mine better, but but I think Wright is a great scholar. I love his book. Yep. I learned a lot from his book. I just take a different approach.
Okay, and we've still got one more caller waiting here. So, caller, you are on the air with Mike Licona.
Hello, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, this is Scott. I'm in Georgia. Enjoying the show. Had a quick question for Mike. This has to do with the debates that you are engaged in really around the world. I'm curious to know which particular alternative theory or theories do you find that are playing prominent with those whom you debate?
That's a fair question. I'd say hallucination of some sort is probably the most common. I don't think it's the strongest by any means. It may even be the weakest, but it's certainly the most common objection.
Do you find that there are differences with regard to where you are in terms of which alternative hypotheses come up, like maybe when you were in Indonesia not too long ago versus South Africa or in the United States, or do you find that there's any difference with regard to the particular theories or hypotheses that are proposed?
Oh, that's a good follow-up question. Yeah, I'd have to say so with the Indonesia especially. South Africa, no. But Indonesia is primarily a Muslim country. Officially, it's at least 90% Muslim. Officially, it's probably a lot less than that, maybe 75% Muslim. Well, that's still a lot. So, of course, with such a heavy Muslim population, probably your major objections against the resurrection over there would be things such as, well, Jesus didn't really die according to the Quran or the Gospel of Barnabas,
Right.
Or the Gospels have all sorts of errors and contradictions, so they're not trustworthy. They bring up a lot of Ehrman's arguments, like one of the previous callers mentioned, and I do think, and I agree with that previous caller, Ehrman is just out to lunch with a lot of these objections that he brings up, just wrong-headed on many of these. But I think that would be the primary objections. You know, you'd be looking at Muslim objections. Gospels are corrupted. Paul distorted the apostolic message, and Jesus didn't die to begin with. So if he didn't die, he couldn't have been resurrected, because that means bringing a corpse back from the dead.
Right. Well, thanks so much. Keep up the good work, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
And we're going to go and take another break. When we get back, we'll start talking about the resurrection itself and the evidence for it. I'm Nick Peters. My guest is Mike Licona. We'll be back after this break.
Join Army Girl for Christ and Minister Grok as they tackle some of today's pressing issues from a Christian point of view on Truth Be Told, every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, check out CYIWorldwide.com.
Hey, this is Minister Grok. Thanks for listening. Although Grok Radio is free, there are costs to upkeep the website, podcast, and purchase Bibles and materials for street ministry. And while we are happy to pay this ourselves out of pocket, we will gladly accept any gift if you feel led to support the shows and our street ministry. You could send a gift or love offering through our website at cyiworldwide.com. Thanks for your support, and God bless.
I am Nick Peters. This is the Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is Mike Licona, and I would like to remind everyone that, yes, we are listener-supported. Everything we do, and that includes Deeper Waters itself, all the work that we do here. And, Mike, I think you definitely agree with me. This is some work worth supporting here, isn't it?
Well, I do think so, Nick. I think you are making a good contribution to the kingdom with your apologetics and the stuff that you do with these podcasts. You're having some great guests on. When you had the guy with cold case for Christianity, you had Craig Blomberg, Rob.
Actually, I haven't had a guest with Cold Case Christianity yet, but for those listening, he's my guest next week. J. Warner Wallace will be here on the Deeper Waters Podcast next week.
Oh, that's great. I mean, you're having a lot of really good guys, good guests, and a lot that are coming on your show. So I think that's great, and the stuff that you're blogging about is great, not only for just apologetics, but you do stuff occasionally for people who have Asperger's and autism, as you and my daughter have. And I think you just fulfill a very unique spot in the kingdom. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. And definitely, when people give, they can their gifts are tax deductible as allowed by law, and it's a great ministry to give to.
And, in fact, we can point out that we can start giving through Ratio Christi as well, can't we?
Yeah, I'm really excited, very excited about your impending relationship with them and what they're looking to do with you. Ratio Christi is just a phenomenal organization, started just a few years ago. But, gosh, they're growing, and they've got chapters all over the world now. I'm just amazed at the explosion of growth in that ministry. And your affiliation with them, I think, is just a really good move on your part and theirs.
And for those curious, what I'll be doing is I'll be not leading a chapter at the university per se, but rather a strong internet presence to deal with things that happen online, and as well what we are going to be calling, I think, the Rapid Response Squad, where students sitting in class, here comes a professor saying something against Christianity, what do? Sends out a message right quick. If I'm there, I see it, I send a response right there so the student can know exactly what to say to the professor.
I think it's just a brilliant idea by Ratio Christi to have such a program. I look forward to that being in place. That's just a really neat idea.
Well, right now, the work that we're doing is being done to support Christianity, which is, of course, built around the resurrection, your area of expertise. So go ahead and give us, in a nutshell, a basic case that you would give for the resurrection.
Well, I'd say that, let's see if I could put it in a nutshell. When historians, we look at the most probable explanation. We don't look for absolute certainty. We look for reasonable or adequate certainty. And, of course, that's kind of subjective, but so is all of history and much of science. So we're looking for reasonable and adequate certainty. How do we determine something has reasonable or adequate certainty? Well, in historical method, there are certain common sense criteria that responsible historians employ. That would be, does a hypothesis account for all of the known facts? A hypothesis that accounts for the most of the known facts over one that doesn't account for as many. The one that accounts for most of them is to be preferred. Does the hypothesis account for those facts without forcing any of them to fit? Does the hypothesis do so without non-evidence assumptions that have to be put in there in order to make the hypothesis work? Is the hypothesis compatible with our background knowledge? So I think these are the kinds of things that we're going to look at primarily. And the hypothesis that fulfills those criteria, answers those questions better than other hypotheses, that's the one that is to be preferred because we would regard it as the most probable explanation. The degree to which a hypothesis surpasses its competitors and its ability to fulfill those criteria would make it more probable. The greater degree, the more probable it is. So that would make us then look at, well, what facts are we looking at? And some facts are more strongly evidenced than others. So the things that we can be most confident about would be something like Jesus' death by crucifixion. I mean, this is something that Ehrman, John Dominic Cross, and many others.
Gerd Ludemann.
Gert Ludemann, an atheist, would say that this is one of the best attested facts of antiquity, Jesus' death by crucifixion. We would look at things such as, I think, Paul. Paul is just great. The way I like to look at it is, if you take a deck of cards, if you play poker or let's say blackjack, of course some cards are worth more than others. You know, if you get handed a 2 card, that's generally not a good card. If you get a king or an ace, those are really good cards. So what's nice about Paul is he's an ace. It really doesn't get much better than what we have with Paul. Here's a guy who hated Christianity. He's very hostile to the Christian faith. And then he has an experience that he is convinced is the risen Jesus appearing to him, and he converts to Christianity as a result, lives a life under persecution, and is eventually beheaded, martyred for his proclamation of the gospel. This is the guy that we can also, with a very, very high degree of confidence, say that he knew the Jerusalem apostles, that he had checked the gospel message, that he was out there preaching publicly, that he ran that by the Jerusalem apostles, the pillars of the church, and those who had known Jesus. And they certified that what he was teaching when it came to the gospel essentials, that message was in alignment with what they were preaching. So when we hear Paul on the gospel message, we can be very, very confident that we are also hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. This is what those who knew Jesus were out proclaiming. Those who knew Jesus best and who led his church afterward. And so that's really neat. So we hear Paul on the resurrection. We see Christ died. He rose from the dead. He appeared to others. And Paul certainly proclaimed the bodily, physical resurrection of Jesus. So now, you know, we've got these kinds of things to consider. What is it now? What kind of hypotheses do you formulate? You know, when you look at the resurrection hypothesis, it perfectly accounts for things such as shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences in individual and in group settings that they were convinced were the risen Jesus appearing to them. The same thing could be said about the skeptic Paul, that he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. You have to be able to account for what these experiences were. It certainly goes hand in hand with Jesus actually rising from the dead. It accounts for all the facts, accounts for them without forcing any of them to fit. There's no ambiguity involved in them. You don't have to have any non-evidence assumptions to come up with that hypothesis. That is the one that was there from the very beginning. In terms of plausibility, is it compatible with our background knowledge? We certainly know that people don't come back from the dead by natural causes, but no one said Jesus' resurrection was by natural causes. I think worst case scenario, we would say that the resurrection hypothesis is neither plausible nor implausible. The plausibility would just be inscrutable. It's unknowable, unable to calculate. But of recent, about the past year, I've begun to consider that I think that there is a degree of plausibility involved in it, insofar as we can show there is some decent evidence for the existence of God, of course. And then I think there's some decent evidence to show that Jesus predicted his imminent death and subsequent resurrection by God, and given that at minimal, most historians of Jesus, even skeptical ones, acknowledge that Jesus claimed to have a unique relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that establishes a context in which if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, man, it just fits hand in glove with this, and we got good evidence that God exists. And if Jesus was who he claimed to be, then God would have wanted to raise Jesus. So I think that can establish a degree of plausibility. When you look at things such as alternative hypotheses like hallucinations, they don't do nearly as well as the resurrection hypothesis. Hallucinations can't account for the group appearances to the disciples, which almost all scholars, even skeptics, accept. And in other words, they accept that the followers of Jesus had experiences in group settings that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Well, since modern psychology tells us that group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible, that would seem implausible. That would fail the plausibility criterion there as well. Hallucination hypothesis also finds it difficult to account for the appearance to Paul, because Jesus would have been the last person in the world Paul would have wanted to see. And certainly he wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. So you'd really be forcing it to fit in there, and so it would lack explanatory power as well. If you want to overcome that and try to make Paul fit, you'd have to posit that he was feeling guilt or something for treating the Christians so and persecuting them. But then, of course, then it becomes ad hoc because there's not a scrap of evidence to show that from Paul or elsewhere that he was experiencing this. So the hallucination hypothesis has very, very little going for it. When you compare and run other hypotheses through the ringer in terms of assessing it according to these criteria for the best explanation, every last one of them fails, and not just a little bit, they fail miserably.
Well, it looks like we've got someone else who's wanting to talk with you right now. Another caller has called in. If someone else wants to call in, the number is 714-242-5180. So, caller, you are on the air with Mike Licona.
Hello. I'm just calling to make a quick testimony. I'm a long-time caller, avid listener. I just got a new headset recently, so I decided to call you in. This is basically the story of how I found God, about when my life got turned upside down. And I mean, if you'll give me a minute and just sit right there, I'd like to tell you my story, if that's all right.
It's your show, Nick, so you tell them, about how long you want to give them.
If you can make it about a minute or so, make it as brief as you can.
Absolutely. I was born and raised in West Philadelphia. When I was young, I spent most of my time on a playground. I was chilling, relaxing. It was pretty cool. We were playing basketball outside of our school once, and a couple of guys, they weren't up to any good. They started making trouble in my living area. I got into a fight, and my mother got very scared, and she said, I've got to move with my auntie and uncle to the other side of the country. So I just decided to whistle for a cab, and when it came near, the license plate said Jesus on it, and there was crosses in a mirror. If anything, I could say this cab was rare, but I said, no, forget it, you're home. And then we went to the airport. We pulled out at the house where I was living at around 7 or 8, so I yelled to the cabbie, yo, Holmes, pray with you later. And then I looked at my kingdom, and God was there, and then I just sat on my throne next to God as the Prince of Jesus. I'm a Jesus warrior.
Well, great. Appreciate that.
And could we quickly make a group prayer, if that's all right?
Your show, Nick.
I guess if you want to say something very quick, say it very quick.
It's for a very dear friend of mine. His name's B. He's got a terrible case of cancer. It's just rotting. It's been there since about 2003. Mm-hmm. And we just pray that it goes away. And during the summer, it always gets progressively worse, and we're heading into the summer now, and it's already getting worse.
All right. Well, we'll be sure to remember that, and we will be talking about something like this later on in the show. So, thanks for calling in.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So, going back to the historical evidence, one thing that I think a lot of the internet skeptics we need to be made clear on this, you never anywhere in there made that most of them think Jesus existed, because in your book you pretty much give a Christ myth a footnote, which is all it deserves, because really in New Testament studies this isn't a topic at all, is it?
It really isn't. It really isn't, and you'll even have skeptical New Testament scholars who will say it's not even worth consideration. The evidence we have for Jesus' existence is very good. It's not just Christian authors, and let me say, the Christian authors who mention him, some of them are contemporaries of Jesus. They saw him. We don't know if Paul saw Jesus. I think there's a real good chance he did. But you've got Mark, who's writing the memoirs of Peter, who would have certainly seen Jesus. John, if Allison and an increasing number of New Testament scholars are correct, if John was an eyewitness of Jesus, an original disciple of Jesus, there you've got an eyewitness. These guys said they were there. They saw him. This is just at minimal. And then you've got non-Christian sources like Tacitus and Josephus, Lucian, Bar Serapion, who mentioned Jesus. Now, typically, that would be far more than we would need in order to establish the existence of a person. So, in order to say Jesus doesn't exist, or never existed, you would have to produce some decent arguments to discredit those sources, all of them. Because really all you need is one good source to show that Jesus existed. And you'll have a few of these guys who make arguments, but they haven't convinced anybody. I mean, you'll convince some folks in high school or a few college students who are naive and really don't have a clue how to do history, and they just jump on the bandwagon. But you really don't find scholars saying that Jesus didn't exist. You might find a handful, but, you'll find a handful of scholars who say that the Holocaust never happened, but nobody really respects them. They think they're flakes, and they are. So the hypothesis that Jesus never existed, I think, is right there on the same plane as saying the Holocaust didn't occur. And what's really amusing, though, is some of these scholars who say that Jesus didn't exist, they just seem so surprised that nobody really gives them any attention or respect. And it reminds me of these contestants on the early episodes of American Idol, where they come out and they just think that they've got this great talent, and they're just shocked when the judges roll their eyes and kind of snicker and then boot them off. But that's what Jesus methods are. You'll rarely find a scholar, someone with a PhD in a relevant field, who takes that position. It's very rare, and you certainly won't find many of them. So I don't really think it's worth consideration. It is certainly not a live discussion within the field of New Testament scholarship.
Okay, I say that just because I know a lot of our listeners do engage with these rabid internet atheists. So it's good to get the word on one of the leading scholars in the field on this topic. Right now, we're going to take another break, and we'll be back after this.
Check out CYIWorldwide.com. CYIWorldwide.com. Home of Grok Radio. Free music downloads, advice, prayer, and support. CYIWorldwide.com. Do you grok? Join Army Girl for Christ and Minister Grok as they tackle some of today's pressing issues from a Christian point of view on Truth Be Told. Every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, check out CYIWorldwide.com.
Okay, and we are back right now with our guest, Mike Licona, and we're discussing the resurrection of Jesus, new historiographical approach. The call-in number is 714-242-5180, Now when you call in, it'll be a serious question. I have had someone who's contacted me and said, yeah, your last caller, that came from a TV show, actually. So, oh well, it happens, okay? But, anyway, one of the best evidences, Mike, that we usually get presented with is a creed that's found in 1 Corinthians 15. Could you elaborate on that some?
Sure. This is just one of the really neat things in the New Testament. And it's got a ton of literature that has been written on it in academia over the last several decades. When you look at 1 Corinthians, the letter that Paul wrote to 1 Corinthians, first of all, of the 13 letters we have in the New Testament attributed to Paul, scholars are virtually unanimous that Paul is certain to have wrote 7 of them. And then of the remaining 6, they're kind of split 50-50, let's say, or maybe even a little bit more in favor of Paul writing most of them, of those 3. And then the last 3, you probably have more scholars than not who would say Paul didn't write them. I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong, I'm just saying where scholars stand. So of the undisputed letters, the 7 undisputed letters of Paul, 1 Corinthians, is one that has membership in that group. It is an undisputed letter of Paul. Chapter 15 is about resurrection. He opens that in verse 1 by saying, hey, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. Now, remember, this is Paul. He's now telling them about the gospel message he preached to the Corinthians when he established the church there. He's writing this letter sometime between maybe the year 52 and 56. He establishes the church in Corinth around the year 51. Jesus is crucified in either 30 or 33. So at max, when he says, I delivered this to you, the one I preached to you when I was with you, at maximum we're looking at 21 years later, and this is the same gospel message that, according to Galatians 2, another undisputed letter of Paul, he ran by the Jerusalem apostles and they certified it was what he was preaching. And by the way, it's not just Paul claiming that this. You had Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who were probably discipled by Peter and John, respectively, and they speak of Paul in very laudatory terms. And in fact, Polycarp says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. So you even have those who probably knew the Jerusalem apostles saying that Paul was teaching what they were teaching. Mm-hmm. So here Paul's saying, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. So this is like treasure. This is the kind of things historians dream of getting, where now we're going to hear from Paul, who knew the Jerusalem apostles, who was teaching what they were teaching, and if we want to know what they were teaching, we got an eyewitness right here, and boom, here's what they were teaching about the gospel, the resurrection of Jesus. And then he introduces that in verse 3, chapter 15, verse 3, by saying, I delivered to you what I also received. In other words, I gave to you what I received from the apostles. This is what I'm going to give you here is oral tradition that was passed down to me by the apostles. And then he gives this creed that Christ died, he was buried, he was raised, he appeared. And then he lists 6 post-mortem, post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to individuals, to groups, and to himself included. And then right after that, he says, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe. And it's very interesting. You don't see this in English, but in Greek it's clear. When he says, this is what we preach, he uses a different word in Greek than he used in verse 1. He says, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you. In verse 1, he uses the term euangelizomai, the gospel that I brought and gave to you as good news. But in verses 12 and 14, he uses the term keruso, or kerygma, which means the official or formal public proclamation. So, in other words, Paul is saying, hey, I want to remind you of the good news that I gave you when I was with you in 51. And then he gives him this good news using an oral tradition that was passed down to him by the Jerusalem apostles. And then he follows it up by saying, this is what we preached, the official, formal, apostolic, public preaching, and this is what you believe. So it's like, wow, this is what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and you have multiple resurrection appearances to individuals, groups, friend, and foe alike. Pretty cool stuff. Comes from eyewitnesses. Early and eyewitness.
Yeah, but Mike, I mean, I can hear the internet skeptics out there and such thing. Where, of course, but these are Christian scholars who are saying this is a creed, and Christian scholars who are dating it early. Now, that's the case, isn't it?
Yes, Christian scholars are certainly attributing this to the apostles, and Christian scholars are certainly dating it early. But so are agnostic scholars and atheist scholars and Jewish scholars. So it's not just Christian scholars. There are plenty of non-Christian scholars who are dating it early and attributing it back to apostolic testimony. This is a heterogeneous conclusion. Well, that differs. You've got someone like a Gert Ludemann, like the late Robert Funk, who was a co-founder of the notorious Jesus Seminar, and they say, within probably 2 to 3 years at most. You'll have James D.G. Dunn, who is a believer, although kind of moderate conservative, and he says within months of the resurrection. For me, I kind of fit in more with, say, Ben Witherington on the subject. I think Ben Witherington is correct when he says it could certainly have gone back that early, but we really have no way to know of that happening. Yes, Paul could have received it 3 years later after or when he went to Jerusalem to meet with Peter, according to Galatians 1. He could have received it in Damascus right after his conversion, if we are to believe Acts chapter 9. So it could have been any time like that. And then, of course, the oral tradition would have been formulated even earlier in Jerusalem. But we just don't know that. What we do know, I think we can say with confidence, is because Paul gave it to the church in Corinth when he was there around the year 51, he said, I delivered to you what I had also received, which means he received it prior to 51. So he receives it within, say, 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion, 21 years at most. And, he's receiving it from people that he regards as being credible. And he had been around the Jerusalem apostles. He had run the gospel past them that he had been preaching. And he says, this is the gospel message. I want to remind you of the gospel message that I preached to you and by which you became Christians. And then he gives them this creed. So I think if he did not receive it from one of the Jerusalem, I think he probably did, but if he didn't, it was certainly the content of that oral tradition in verses 3 through 7 is certainly something he would have known to be true, in terms of death, burial, and resurrection appearances from the people he lists, Peter, James, the 12, the more than 500, all the apostles. He would have known that these guys were claiming such a thing because he had been with them. So this is just awesome stuff, from the viewpoint of a historian. It doesn't get a lot better than that, especially when we consider that Paul was a non-believer at the time of his conversion, and he wasn't just apathetic or neutral about it. He was so hostile against Christ that he was persecuting the church. And that's why I say Paul is the ace in our hand. It doesn't really get much better for historical testimony than what we have from Paul.
Yeah, Mike, I think some people would raise a disagreement with you on this, that Paul never really talks about the resurrection, because he doesn't mention the empty tomb, and throughout the chapter in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about a spiritual body, and Paul rising as a life-giving spirit, which means he wasn't talking about anything physical. What's your response?
Well, I'd say let's look at Paul's writings. In fact, let's just go with 1 Corinthians 15, since he does say those things that you mentioned. When you look at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, he says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. Now, to be asleep was a euphemism in antiquity, meaning the person was dead. All right. So just like today we say he passed away, rather than saying he croaked, in antiquity they would say he fell asleep and went to be with his forefathers. The first fruits is what you would talk about, the first to be harvested from a crop. So, it's kind of like most of us have at some point or another had a garden in the backyard where you grow a tomato plant or something. I'm down here in Georgia, and down here a lot of people have it in the front yard, and they watch it grow from their couch on the front porch. I love Georgia. But so you have a tomato plant, you pick a tomato off, that's the first fruit, the first to be ripe. The others are coming later, but the first that you pull off that tomato plant is the first fruit. So Christ, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:20, is the first to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. When are the rest going to be raised? Paul answers that 3 verses later. He says, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits. After that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So Jesus is raised in, let's say, April of 30 or April of 33, and then everybody else is going to be raised, according to Paul, when Jesus returns at his second coming. Now, what happens to us in the meantime? Well, you look at some other of Paul's undisputed letters, like 2 Corinthians, which Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, or Philippians chapter 1, another undisputed letter, where Paul says his desire to depart or to die and be with Christ, that's better, but to remain on in the body is more necessary for the sake of the church at Philippi at that point. So Paul's options, he sees, is you die and you go right to be with Christ, or you can remain in the body. One other scripture I'd give you would be 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, another undisputed letter of Paul, and probably the very first of the letters of his we have that was written. And it was written in the 40s, the late 40s. So Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he talks about the second coming of Christ, and he says that Christ is going to bring with him those who have died. So he's bringing with him, and then he says the trumpet is going to blow, and then the voice of the archangel, and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. He's bringing them with him, and then he's going to raise them. So in other words, I think what Paul is talking about here, when you put it all together, when we die, our body is buried, our spirit leaves our body and goes to be with Christ in heaven. When Christ returns, he brings our spirits back with him, puts them back in our bodies, resurrects our bodies, and then transforms them into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. And so that, of course, is a bodily resurrection. And Christ is the first fruits of the dead. If we're going to be raised physically in terms of our corpse, that means since Christ is the first fruits, he was raised physically in his corpse. And I would just add one more thing, and that is, if Wright is correct, and I think he is correct in saying that in antiquity, when they said resurrection, it was always something that referred to the corpse. Paul didn't need to talk about an empty tomb. When he said resurrection, people knew what he was talking about. It'd be kind of like saying, my baby died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. You don't have to talk about an empty crib. Everybody already knows that's implied. Now, when you talk about spiritual resurrection, go ahead.
I was going to say, didn't you do a word study, in fact, on physical and spiritual and such?
I did. When you look at verses 42 to 44 in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul begins to contrast our current body with our resurrection body. And he says, hey, it's buried, a body that's corruptible, it's going to be raised incorruptible. It is buried in weakness, it is raised in power. It is buried dishonorably, it is raised in glory. It is buried a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. What has confused people over time is there are a few translations out there. The Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the Amplified Bible. There's one out, just came out, published by the United Methodist Church. I think it's called the Common Bible or something like that. That has it that way, and then I think the New Jerusalem Bible has it this way, where it says, it is sown or buried a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. And that is a very poor translation. I did a study on those words. The two words are, let's see, for natural or physical there is psychikon, from psyche, for life or soul, and then the other is pneumatikon, from spirit, meaning spiritual. And what I did was I examined those words. Every time those words were used in the extant Greek literature from the 8th century before Christ through the 3rd century. So 1,100 years of how it was used. 8 centuries all the way up, 8 centuries before Christ, all the way up to the time of Jesus, and then into the 3rd century. And I found that spiritual, pneumatikon, is used, I think it's 1,100 and some times. And of those, the meaning, it can mean spiritual in terms of ethereal, ghost-like, but it could also mean spiritual, like if I were to say, Nick Peters is a spiritual guy. He's got his mind on spiritual things. He lives according to godly spiritual principles. Chrysippus, before Christ, I think he's the 3rd or 4th century BC, he talks about the Stoics being spiritual people. So it could mean one or the other. So that doesn't help us a whole lot. But when you look at the term psychikon, 846 times it appears. And of those, I could not find a single occurrence where it meant physical. It would meant things like warm. It would meant things like emotional. It would mean things like, Paul says just a few chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14 or 15. He says, the natural man, psychikon, same word, the natural man cannot understand the things of the Spirit, pneumatikon, same term, because they are spiritually discerned. So he's talking about the natural man, a man who's thinking according to natural, earthly wisdom, is not going to understand spiritual wisdom or the gospel. It's not going to make sense to him. You've got to be tuned into the Spirit to understand these things. So I think it has various meanings, but one thing is for certain. It never means physical. So this translation in, let's say, the Revised Standard Version, Amplified Bible, natural or physical, that is no longer sustainable. That is an impossible translation. It's wrong. I think what Paul is saying in this text is the body that is buried, as when we're alive, our body is animated by natural organs, hearts, lungs, liver, kidney, spleen, things like this. This is how it's animated. This is how it survives. Just like some things are steam-powered, diesel-powered, nuclear-powered, our bodies are empowered by natural organs. But the resurrection body is going to be animated. It's going to be empowered by the Holy Spirit. And I think that's what Paul is saying there. So it has nothing to do with being buried a physical body and raised as a spiritual body. That is not at all what Paul is saying. And interesting enough, the root of pneumatikon, pneuma, and the root of psychikon, psyche, are the same terms that Paul uses just a few verses later in verse 49 when he says, calls Jesus a life-giving spirit. So, it's not referring to material versus immaterial. It's talking about how something is animated.
Okay, we'll be back after this break to wrap things up with Mike Licona. We're going to get a bit personal after this. We'll be back after this break.
Join Unituber and Army Girl for Christ as they discuss spiritual warfare, spiritual preparedness, the end times, life issues, and personal and spiritual growth. That's TruthRadioNet.com. TruthRadioNet.com.
Check out CYIWorldwide.com. CYIWorldwide.com. Home of Grok Radio. Free music downloads, advice, prayer, and support. CYIWorldwide.com. Do you grok?
And we're back with Mike Licona here, and I have been taking calls today, but for this last segment, I'm going to ask that people not call in, because I'm going to get really personal with Mike as he shares some stuff that's really important for him right now. Because when we talk about the resurrection, it can become usually an academic exercise and such, and we don't really grasp the importance of it, but we need to know what the importance of it is. And right now, Mike, you're thinking about your mother a lot, aren't you?
My mother, yeah. My mom has been struggling with cancer for 6 years. So, like the other caller a few months ago said that, he's got a friend who's been struggling with cancer. My mom got cancer about 6 years ago. She was taking a shower one morning. She was in her late 60s, and she noticed a lump on her breast, and she had not had a mammogram in over 5 years. She went in, it was biopsied, she got the bad news, and she had breast cancer. It was stage 4. It had metastasized. It was in her lymph nodes, and it was in her back, in the bones. And the prognosis was not good. They said, we want to do chemo for several weeks, and then we want to remove one of your breasts and your lymph nodes, and then do radiation for several weeks. And so they did. It was a very, very difficult, uncomfortable process for her, but they did. It extended her life for a while. And it just seemed like it came back the spring of every year. And she'd have to go get some chemo and radiations, things like that. So she would do that, and it would go away for a little bit, but it would come back. Last year it came back. It was in her brain as well, so they had to get brain surgery, remove the tumor. They had to, it had gotten in her hip. She broke her hip. They had to do a partial hip replacement. They had to do radiation in her back. They had to do chemo again. And then the Cancer Treatment Centers of America in Philadelphia, phenomenal place. They loved it. They treated her so well, and they really helped her when her typical doctors had given up hope. And they gave her another year of life, and they did it while able to maintain a quality of life as well. So, great organization up there. But it came back again this spring, and it came back with a real vengeance. And this appears, aside from a miracle, is going to be her demise. It's going to take her life, and it's probably within the next couple of weeks. So it's a very difficult time. I was in Baltimore for 2.5 weeks. I got back about a week and a half ago. I got 2.5 weeks to spend with my mom up there. Just a wonderful, wonderful time. Best time I've ever had with her. She's a believer. And I guess I could say, Nick, is, I'm going to miss my mom terribly when she dies because, we're pretty close. But I would also say that I have the hope that I'm going to see her again, that she's going to die, and we're going to be apart for a while. It could be hours, in case I die shortly thereafter. It could be days, could be weeks, months, years, decades. I don't know, but at most probably just a few decades, and then I'm going to see her again. And I have the confidence and the comfort that I'm going to see her again. Why? Because Jesus rose from the dead. And if Jesus rose from the dead, as Paul said, because Christ has been raised, we're going to be raised. And we can have the confidence that he says, because of this, if Christ has not been raised, he said, let's eat and drink, let's go party now, because tomorrow we die. There's no God out there. There's no one to be accountable to. If Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised, period. Do whatever we want at this point. But he says that Christ has been raised, and we're going to have the confidence we can have the confidence that we're going to live after our death. Death is only a transitional stage where, we're able to shed these bodies for a little time until the resurrection occurs. We get them back, but we're going to be with Christ in heaven. So it's just a transition, and it's a transition to a far, far better place and mode of existence. When I was up there with my mom, I got thinking, if God doesn't exist, if Jesus did not raise from the dead, if he wasn't raised from the dead, then when my mom dies, I'll never see her again. And this is it. And this woman I love, a woman who's given me so much love and given me so much, that's just the end of her existence. And that is a time of unbearable grief. I'm not saying that you become a Christian as an emotional crutch that you can stand on just to comfort you. But it is nice to know that because Jesus lives today, because he is God's uniquely divine Son, because he rose from the dead and promises eternal life to those who buy into his program, and my mom has and I have, that we're going to have eternal life. And I'll get to see her again. So our time apart is only temporary. So when she dies, I will miss her. But I will know that as soon as she dies, she is transferred into a new mode of existence, into heaven, where there's just unspeakable joy and happiness. And I know she's not even really going to be thinking about me or caring much about matters on earth. She knows that things are just going to be fine because God is he's in control. And I'm going to see her again someday. And that is great comfort. And I began to understand more what Paul meant when he said, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? The victory is in Christ because of Jesus' resurrection. And whereas I've never really in the past needed to take a look at this before in this kind of way, it has brought me great comfort at this time. It has brought my mom great comfort. And I know it brought Gary Habermas great comfort when his first wife died back in the 90s.
It's so amazing. It was just all around us. I've got an aunt and uncle who we live next door to, and my uncle got out of the emergency room just a while ago. And, my aunt and uncle are both very elderly, and so it makes us think about that situation as well. So we asked for prayers for all these people, and shortly after Allie and I got married, as you know, my grandmother passed away, and we went to the funeral Allie and I did, and I was one of the 3 ministers assigned to speak at a funeral, and I was the last one assigned to speak, which meant I had to wrap everything up, and I had to be the sort of master of ceremonies and take, statements from the audience about here's what my grandmother's life was like. And I'd said, going up there, I think I'm going to get up and I'm going to speak. I've only got about 10 minutes. I'm going to speak about the resurrection for 5, give a historical basis for it, and then talk about what a difference it makes. And I remember being told, oh, don't do that. It won't work. It won't work. You really shouldn't do that. Well, I'm a little bit stubborn. I did it anyway. And I think it worked out great. Everyone there, I think, really enjoyed it. I honestly think it's hard, but we left happy overall. And what I'd like to remind people is that when you're praying for Mike here, his mother, my wife's grandmother, is the one who raised him in a Christian faith. And you really have her in a large way to thank for what and who Mike is today. And he would definitely appreciate your prayers, and I'd appreciate them as well, because this is going to be hard on our household as well.
Yeah. We will definitely miss my mom. We grieve because we miss being with them, but I won't be grieving because of her current state. She'll be happier than I'll ever be here on the earth the moment she dies. So I'm not worried about her in that sense. I'll just grieve because I'll miss her. and so will Allie as well. But it's just nice to know that that grief is just limited. When you're an atheist or a non-believer and you have no hope of eternal life and someone you dearly love dies, what a difference that makes. And I'm not saying, again, you become a Christian just so you can get that comfort. It's not a psychological crutch. But it is one of the benefits of holding truth. Because Christianity is true, when it comes down, this isn't just a heady thing where you're looking to say, oh, yeah, I know for a fact Christianity is true. Okay, what's for dinner? It's not just another fact. This is a fact that applies to me in my everyday life. And when it comes to life and death, it makes all the difference in the world.
And, Mike, the text in 1 Thessalonians 4 says something very special for us. It says, we mourn, which tells us it's okay to mourn. We should mourn, in fact. But it says, but we don't mourn like those who have no hope.
Yes, absolutely right.
And, if we go further than that, the promise of resurrection isn't just that your mother and my grandmother and everyone else who's died in Christ will live again. But it just doesn't stop there. We're looking forward to the resurrection of the entire cosmos. We're looking forward to God restoring things. We look around and we see a world that's just rotten, as it were, and we ask, what's the hope for this world? I know a lot of Christians have been very concerned, for instance, about what's going on in our country, especially after this week, and ask, what's the hope? And the hope that we have is the same hope that we've had for 2,000 years. It's the hope that Jesus rose again.
Yeah, that is our hope, Nick. My hope is not in the United States of America. I love our country. I think we've got one of the greatest, if not the greatest, country in the world. I am proud to be an American. I'm proud to live here. I am ashamed of some of the laws that are coming down of recent, such as the approval of homosexual marriage, the abortion issue, approving of abortions. I'm just ashamed of some of these laws. But my hope is not in the United States of America. My citizenship is in heaven, according to Paul in Philippians chapter 3. And I don't want to put my hope in the United States of America. I'm going to be disappointed. It's run by humans. Most Christians in this world live in countries where they are oppressed because they are Christians. And so they don't have hope in their countries. My hope is in Jesus Christ. And, he commands us. He says, if you want to be my disciple, you got to be willing to take up your cross and follow me. And you're going to be persecuted. He says, if I'm persecuted, you're going to be persecuted if you follow me. We need to be willing to do that. And as Christians, to stand up for our Christian beliefs. We can get involved in the political process if we want. I have no desire to do that. I will vote in certain ways. I really don't care about politics myself. I don't have anything against those who do. I think, go for it. But I think the greatest thing that we can do as believers is share the gospel, to love others so that they can see the love of Christ in us. Jesus told us we are salt and light. Salt to preserve righteousness, justice, and morality, and we are supposed to be light. And as our country goes into moral dark ages, as I heard Frank Beckwith say the other day, as we go into another moral dark age, we can be the light. And the light, even a candle, produces light in utter darkness. And as our country goes into more moral darkness, it gives us as Christians a greater opportunity to present the light, which is found in nothing else but the gospel, and that's what we need to focus on anyway.
And we really need Christians in this country who recognize what the resurrection is and what difference it makes. And I would even say to a lot of apologists out there that if you're out here, if you're studying, you're defending the resurrection, and you're not living about the difference it makes and sharing what difference it makes, as far as I'm concerned, you're wasting your time.
Resurrection, like Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, our our faith is worthless. So it's a wonderful topic for study. There's a lot more that can be done on it. I know I could study the resurrection the rest of my life and still not know everything about the evidence for it and all the different fields related to it. It's a fun field. Plenty more work to be done. New Testament studies is done. Nick, I'm really proud of you for the work that you're doing. I want you to continue it.
I appreciate it. And I want to remind people before we go that next week we're going to have J. Warner Wallace right here in the studio. That's just going to be another awesome show, I think. For those who don't know, he's the author of Cold Case Christianity, recent addition to the Stand to Reason staff, and runs a Please Convince Me podcast. So it's going to be a great show, isn't it, Mike?
It is. I've met Jay. We spoke at a conference last year down in, I think it was Arizona. Yeah, Arizona with Sean White. The
Smart Faith Conference.
Smart Faith, and I met Jay there, and we had a great time. He's a really good guy, and your listeners next week are in for a treat.
And from what I've seen of Sean on Facebook, I think he's a great guy as well. But we've got a little under 4 minutes left, so Mike, just give us any final messages you want to give about the resurrection, what difference it makes, what you think listeners should do, etc.
Well, if the listener wants to learn more about the historical evidence for the resurrection, there are a number of good sources out there. If you want something basic, Gary Habermas and I wrote a book that was published in 2004, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And what's neat about that book, we did something unique in it that we thought was raising the bar, and that is we included in the back of the book a CD which has a video game. And the video game is a simulated television game show with a three-dimensional animated game show host who's pretty funny, and he helps you master the information in the book. Sorry, it only works for PCs. I guess you could do it on a Mac if you have a PC emulator on the Mac. But it's just a really fun game. We had a company that produced tank simulators for the Department of Defense, and they made it for us, over $250,000 worth of labor for free to put this game together, and it helps you master the information in the book. So if you want to learn the evidence, some of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I'd say it's an intermediate kind of book. It's not going to be your most basic, but it's not going to be too heavy for a reader. And they want to be able to answer probably 95% of everyone they're going to encounter. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and myself is a really good choice. If you want to know how to answer Muslims, because their arguments are going to be different, then I wrote a book that was published in 2006 titled Paul Meets Muhammad, and that is a novel. It's a short novel, a narrative, which is a simulated debate between the Apostle Paul and the Prophet Muhammad on what happened to Jesus. Of course, I put the evidence for the resurrection, the argument on Paul's lips, and I take the standard arguments given by Muslims against the resurrection and put them on the lips of Muhammad. And I try to make him as persuasive as possible, as persuasive as a Muslim apologist would be. And tried not to pull any punches so that Christians would be familiar.
60 seconds.
Christians would be familiar with those arguments. So they want to know how to have intelligent discussion with Muslims. Paul Meets Muhammad. If they really, really want to get in depth with the resurrection of Jesus, and it's a book that almost anybody can read, would be the big one that I wrote, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. Very in-depth on historical method and applying it to the resurrection and comparing with alternate hypotheses.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike, for being my guest today on the Deeper Waters podcast. It's been a fascinating show, and I hope we'll be seeing you back sometime. I highly anticipate that we will be.
Yeah, well, that'll be fun, Nick. And so God bless you and all your listeners.
Okay, and remember, next week we'll be back with J. Warner Wallace of Cold Case Christianity. For now, I'm Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters Podcast, signing off.